This is the 3D VIEW-MASTER adventure, The Time Tunnel. VIEW-MASTER Reel 1. Rendezvous with yesterday. Picture 1. Fasten your seatbelt, Senator, came the pilot's voice. We are landing. I let you off here. Senator Clark, the only passenger in the jet, looked out the window in surprise. Below was a vast desert. Minutes later, he stood alone in the wilderness, listening to the roar of the departing jet. In the distance, a speck enlarged into a sedan approaching across the desert. As it arrived, he saw that it contained 2 men. Senator Clark, I'm Doug Phillips, said the younger of the 2. This is General Kirk, commander of the military detachment of Project Time Tunnel. I'm head of the scientific team. Hope we haven't kept you waiting. Clark got into the car and they sped across the trackless waste. Suddenly, ahead, a camouflaged area of ground slid smoothly back to reveal a ramp leading into the earth. The car went down the ramp into an underground passage and parked. The 3 men climbed out. The next minutes were a succession of confusing experiences for Clark. Sentry challenges, electronic fingerprinting, doors sliding open, views of enormous power installations, a swift elevator drop deep down into the earth. Finally, the time tunnel complex itself. Picture 2. The tunnel, its yawning elliptical mouth dominating the control area, seemed to stretch back to infinity. Ranged in front of it were banks of control panels. Phillips, my Senate committee has gone over your budget, said Clark. Is time travel really worth all this? Senator, said Doug firmly, the control of time is the most valuable treasure man will ever search for. Clark grunted. So far, according to your report, all you've managed to send back in time are mice and monkeys at a cost to the government of $7 billion. Doug, I think Tony ought to be in on this, said Kirk. Picture 3. A younger scientist stepped out of the tunnel to greet them. Senator Leroy Clark, said Doug. This is Dr. Anthony Newman, the number 2 man on this project. Dr. Newman's grin was enthusiastic. I'm glad you think enough of our project to pay us a call, Senator. Tony, interposed Doug. Senator Clark feels our experiments haven't shown enough success. But we're so close now, protested Tony. So close to sending a man back in time and returning him safely. Then do it, demanded Clark. No more promises, boys. Do it today. Tomorrow night I'm going back to Washington to write you a blank check or kill the project. Doug, let me be the junior pick, urged Tony. Absolutely no, said Doug. We're not ready to risk a life, not even to satisfy a Senate committee. Tony looked grim. Excuse me, he said and left. Picture 4. It was night and the control room was empty. Tony, in slacks and sweater, entered stealthily. He moved from panel to panel, throwing switches and adjusting dials. Then, at the master control, he set a device labeled automatic countdown. He walked into the tunnel mouth. Red alert, boomed Doug's voice on the speaker. Picture 5. In the observation booth, high above, Doug continued to call into the microphone. Emergency! All tunnel personnel, report to your stations on the double. As Doug and the others descended from the booth and ran toward the tunnel entrance, they saw Tony inside it. Doug moved to the countdown device and scanned it. "Too late to stop him," said Doug. "He'd burn alive." A blue light bathed Tony in an eerie mist. His form grew indistinct, then vanished. Picture 6. Tony blinked. He found himself sprawling on the deck of an ocean liner. Painfully, he rose to his feet. Almost in disbelief, he breathed. "I made it. Are you hurt?" It was the British accented voice of a young woman in a nearby deck chair. She was blonde, pretty, and dressed in the style of the early 1900s. "No, I'm all right, really. I wasn't looking where I was going." He looked around. "It's a big ship." "It's supposed to be the biggest one ever built," she said. "I'm Althea Hall. You're American, aren't you?" "Yes, Anthony Newman," he shivered. "It's chilly. Quite cold for April," she agreed. "But so was London. I hope it's warmer when we reach New York." Picture 7. "All right," snapped Doug. "Start a location probe. Ray, see if you can synchronize a time curve and find what specific radiation Tony used." Dr. Raymond Swain and Dr. Anne McGregor, two of the supervising scientists, hurried to their computers. "Where is he?" asked Clark. "He could be living in yesterday, or next week, or 1,000,000 years ago," said Doug. "The radiation path, that blue mist you saw just before he disappeared, will give him a magnetic fix to enable us to locate him in time. When we do, Tony and his immediate environment will show up on the image screen. We'll see him and hear him." A wavering blur appeared on the screen, and they began to hear eerie sounds of splashing water. As they adjusted the control dials carefully, the picture sharpened into the clear image of an ocean liner on a moonlit sea. "I'd know those lines anywhere," spoke up General Kirk. "That's the Titanic. Tony has gone back to the year 1912. VIEW-MASTER Reel 2, Picture 8. "Captain, I must speak to you," said Tony urgently. "It's very important." Captain Malcolm Smith interrupted his deck stroll to stare in surprise at this agitated stranger. "My name is Newman, sir," continued Tony. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like a lunatic, but this ship is going to strike an iceberg and sink. You must believe me, for the sake of thousands of lives." Captain Smith stiffened. "I trust this is not a poor attempt at a practical joke," he said coldly. "Newman? I don't recall the name." "I'm not on the passenger list, Captain. I'm part of a scientific team in the year 1968. Smith turned to his first mate, who stood behind him. "Mr. Granger, this gentleman is a confessed stowaway. Please see that he is confined until we reach New York." A seaman accompanying the captain moved to Tony's side and gripped his arm. "Come along, mate." Picture 9. Tony was startled as Althea entered the crew cabin where he was confined. "How did you find me?" he asked. "I just spoke to the captain. Is it true that you're a stowaway? And that you're saying the ship will sink?" "Althea," interrupted Tony, "can you tell me what time it is?" "The exact time. It's desperately important." "It's 10:06 p.m., she said, puzzled. "Why?" Tony set his wristwatch. "What's that?" she asked. He realized that a wristwatch was, to her, a futuristic gadget. "This is a watch from the year 1968, he said. Picture 10. "Maggie," said Doug, "get the boys on the history computer to give you a complete rundown on the Titanic. Also the year, the day, and the minute she went down." "But how can Dr. Newman be affected by a disaster that happened before he was born?" asked Senator Clark. "Because he is actually living in the year 1912 now," explained Doug. "If he's on that ship when she goes down, he'll probably die with the others." All through the night, the haggard group at the time tunnel control struggled to keep the image in focus. The next morning, they received a direct message. Tony, slumped in a chair in the crew cabin, lifted his head. "Doug, I don't know if you're picking me up," he said, "but I'm on the Titanic, locked in a forward crew cabin. It's 9:15 a.m., April 14th, 1912. Image and sound faded. The Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 Sunday night, April 14, said Doug, and sank during the early hours of Monday, April 15. That means we have 14 hours to save Tony. I'm going through the tunnel. Have research get me a copy of a New York paper for April 15, 1912. I'll show those headlines to the captain of the Titanic." In a few minutes, the newspaper arrived. Senator Clark scanned the historic front page curiously as Doug reappeared dressed as a 1912 tourist. Doug took the paper, folded it, and hid it inside his jacket. Picture 11. As Doug's journey through time was being programmed, the group looked anxiously into the tunnel. If we overshoot him a day or more, he'll get there before Tony did, Dr. Swain told Senator Clark. "Or a day late, and he'll wind up in freezing waters where the ship has already sunk, with Tony on it." Picture 12. The countdown began. "Doug, be careful," said Anne. She held his eyes for an instant, then looked away. Doug stepped into the tunnel, and the radiation bath misted him in a blue-violet silhouette. At 0, he moved deeper into the tunnel and disappeared. Picture 13. "Air now," blurted a stoker, with his shovel in mid-air. "Where'd you come from?" Doug scrambled off the boiler room coal pile, picked up the newspaper, which had fallen from inside his jacket, and managed an apologetic smile. "Sorry, guess I went through the wrong door." He backed hastily out. Having studied the plans of the ship thoroughly, Doug soon found the companionway leading to the crew cabin in which Tony was imprisoned. He walked briskly up to the guard and said, "I'm Dr. Phillips. Captain Smith has asked me to examine the prisoner, Mr. Newman." Picture 14. Reunited, the two scientists from 1968 made desperate plans. The only way to forestall the disaster, they decided, would be to take over the ship's wireless room and send distress signals in advance of the collision. As the guard looked in to say, "Time's up, sir," they jumped him simultaneously, seized his pistol and tied and gagged him. Then they hurried to the wireless room. "May I help you?" asked the wireless officer. Doug pointed the gun at him. VIEW-MASTER Reel 3, Picture 15. Doug's finger was on the key, tapping out the signal CQD, the distress call commonly used in 1912. Just then the door burst open and in strode Captain Smith. "What on earth?" he roared. Then, recognizing Tony, "Oh, it's you, and I see you have a Confederate gentleman. You're in serious trouble, I promise you." "Captain," said Doug, "I know you won't believe us, but you can believe your eyes." He opened the 1912 newspaper and thrust the front page at Smith. "Your ship will strike an iceberg at 11:40 tonight and go down. The story's here in tomorrow's newspaper." Angrily, without looking at the paper, the captain crumpled it into a ball. He tossed it through an open porthole into the Atlantic. It was night. In the gay main saloon of the Titanic, Captain Smith mingled with the social leaders of 2 continents. As he chatted with College and Mrs. John Jacob Astor, the wall clock showed 11:40. A few of the people felt a slight bump. A few heard a muffled grating sound. Picture 16. Within a few minutes, however, the word had spread. "We've struck an iceberg!" The scene in the salon had changed to one of panic as passengers struggled into life jackets and stampeded for the decks. In their prison-like room below the waterline, Doug and Tony felt the jar of the collision more strongly. They knew that the iceberg's knife-sharp edge had sliced the ship's hull open for 300 feet. Suddenly, the door of their cabin opened and Captain Smith stalked in. He frowned and bit his lip. "We've hit an iceberg, just as you 2 predicted. How could you have known?" "Captain," replied Doug, "the only explanation is the truth. We come from the year 1968. What is happening here is history to us. We also know this. Your life-saving equipment is not adequate. More than 1,500 lives will be lost." "Sir, we might be of more use on the decks," suggested Tony. "We could help." "Yes, of course." He paused. "Maybe you even know whether I'm going to die tonight." "Yes, sir, I'm afraid you will." Picture 17. Hurriedly, Doug and Tony followed the captain topside. On the way, Tony saw an abandoned life jacket and picked it up. As he passed the main salon, he heard a piano playing a melancholy little tune. He entered and found Althea sitting alone at the keyboard. "Hurry, Althea," he urged. "The boats are loading." She seemed in a daze. "You knew," she said softly. He put the life jacket on her and led her to the deck. Picture 18. There was panic on deck, yet there was order too. "Women and children first," shouted the crewman. These people of 1912 had a certain elegance in facing disaster, Tony reflected as he shoved Althea into a loading lifeboat. The ship's orchestra was playing gay ragtime music. A well-dressed, dignified man kissed his wife goodbye and stepped back to await almost certain death. "See you later, dearie," he told her nonchalantly. "That's Colonel Astor," said Althea, with a catch in her throat. She turned to Tony. "You know all this. You are from the future. I'll never see you again." Picture 19. The image on the time tunnel screen was clear now, and the group saw and heard the milling crowd on deck. "To have to stand here watching people die. It's horrible," said Senator Clark. Amid the shouts and screams, the blasts of exploding boilers, came another sound. the ship's orchestra now playing a slow, solemn melody. "The Navy hymn," said Kirk, awed. A chill tangled the spines of the listeners as they recalled the words. "Oh, hear us as we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea." "We've got to get Doug and Tony out of there," said Swain. "Hurry!" They saw Doug and Tony running out on deck. A boiler exploded behind the pair, sending them reeling against the chain rail. The rail broke. Doug and Tony plunged overboard. In the time tunnel, a switch was thrown. The image screen went blank. Picture 20. "Where are they?" asked Clark. "If the time transfer worked, they are in some other time zone," said Anne. "We won't know where or when until we trace them." Clark looked at his watch and stood up wearily. "I must get back to Washington," he said, shaking hands with General Kirk. "Thank you for all your courtesies. Let me know the minute you find Dr. Phillips and Dr. Newman. I'll urge my committee to approve your budget." Picture 21. Desperately, Doug and Tony stumbled through the tangled undergrowth of a hot, steaming jungle. They glanced back in fear at a huge prehistoric reptile. "It's gaining on us," gasped Tony. "Faster!" Suddenly, in front of them, a thick, swirling fog began to billow out. As it spread in all directions, the jungle and dinosaurs seemed to dissolve. Slowly, the fog materialized into the oval outlines of the time tunnel. "They did it!" shouted Doc. He and Tony raced into the tunnel, calling, "Anne! Ray! General! We're home!"